Let's talk to Lord Stuart Jackson, though, Conservative peer, of course, a man that knows a thing or two about Brexit as well. I might ask you about that, Stuart, before we talk about the investment situation. Very good morning to you, by the way. Happy Easter.
And you, Mike.
Tell me why Keir Starmer is trying to edge ever closer to the European Union. You know, people voted in 2016 fairly clearly and fundamentally to leave the EU. He seems to think we should be getting closer to them as the time goes on.
Well, the problem with Keir Starmer is that he thinks that he can straddle the divide between the United States and the European Union, and I don't think he can, because at the moment, going before the Commons is a bill called the Product Regulation Bill, which sounds very innocuous, but means that despite having left the EU formally in 2021, we're going to accept for all our manufactured goods EU regulations, and we're going to have adjudication on those decisions and those regulations made by a foreign court, the European Court of Justice, without any input from the UK. So we won't be able to write the laws and we won't be able to adjudicate them in any court of law. And it's essentially a backdoor way of the Labour Party getting into a position of saying, well, look, we're following all the rules, we're doing everything the EU are doing, we might as well rejoin the single market and the customs union.
Yeah.
And obviously that's the long-term aim of someone like Keir Starmer and many in his cabinet who never accepted Brexit, think that the Brexit vote was a catastrophic error and not a great opportunity, which it is.
Yeah, indeed. Because he's also getting involved in some kind of net zero coordinated policy that he wants to share with the European Union. And just the other day we saw he wants some kind of food standards rule applied to the UK as well, which was one of the specific things that people didn't want to be a part of.
Yeah, and really what the significance of this is, of course, that if you tie yourself into EU rules over which, as I say, you have no control effectively, you don't generate the rules and you don't adjudicate the rules, then other regimes, particularly the United States, will quite possibly say to you, look, we can't trade with you. We can't have a free trade agreement or a free trade treaty with you because you're effectively still in the EU because you're accepting the EU rules. And so when the EU is bringing forward more regulation, more bureaucracy, more red tape in areas like digital, which is extremely important and fast growing, the United States is going to say, look, you are to all intents and purposes just an adjunct to the EU. And we can't trust your word on this. And that's why, I mean, there's a huge amount of hypocrisy here. The EU is complaining about the US tariffs. What do they think the common tariff that they've had around the EU, locking out third world countries' products for the last 40 odd years? That is a tariff. Yeah. But apparently it's good when it's the EU, but it's terrible when it's Donald Trump and the United States. It's riddled with hypocrisy. And I do think eventually Starmer and the Labour government are going to have to make a value judgment on who they align with, whether it will be the United States, the biggest and most dynamic economy in the world, or the EU, which over the years is going to shrink in dollar denomination value in trade and has got lots of economic problems.
Exactly right. And just quickly on this story about investment by pension funds into the defence business, you've drawn our attention to a piece that was in The Critic recently, written by James Graham, about how despite what the government says about investment going into defence and more money being spent, more GDP as a percentage being spent, there are a lot of pension funds that are not investing in defence, and partly that's the result of this ESG orthodoxy, environmental, social factors, ethical investing and all of that. But it turns out that the MP's pension fund doesn't even do it.
Well, I have to declare an interest here as a former MP because that is my pension fund, and therefore I do have a vested interest. But I do think the broader point is that the defence industry is a very successful part of our economy in the UK, one of the most successful. And the idea that right from student unions locking out defence contractors coming in to do graduate fairs all the way through to having a policy which says we're going to have nothing whatsoever to do with investing in defence companies, which is technology, which is skills, which is new jobs, I think is crazy. And particularly as we are encouraging people to join the armed forces now, we have to spend more of our gross domestic product on the defence industry. And we're encouraging critics, of course, but one of the things Trump has done is energise and catalyse the European Union to look at defending its own interests by spending more on crazy. But we're taking a position in government, and I'm quite sadly in the private sector, in the corporate world, of saying that that's persona non grata, verboten. We cannot touch defence funds, because if we don't invest in defence, we're going to be in a very weak position in terms of national security and our future safety.
Yeah, absolutely right. Lord Stuart Jackson, great to have you on. We'll have to get you back on again